I made it through the blizzard. Just for everybody at home watching, it's like 6 feet of snow, right, out there, everybody? Yeah. So, I'm glad those of you that made it can make it. Coming up from Florida, yeah. I was kind of joking when I was talking to this. It's really only about an inch of snow, but to me, you know, it might as well be 6 feet. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Johnny Winn. I am also Johnny Roger online. I'm also the host of the Elixir Fountain. We're going to do kind of a little something different than I originally planned. Because this is a meetup, I kind of really want to focus on a lot of the code stuff. There's 2 different things that I've been working on. One of them is this talk. In this talk, we're going to actually be doing replicating mitosis. And of course, I'll kind of explain to you exactly what mitosis is for those of you that don't remember 9th grade biology. But other than that, we're also going to talk about how I use Phoenix. There's actually, I use it a little differently than most people typically do. I don't use controllers for one. I don't use models. Doing something. Is that okay? Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, cool. I was like, oh, something's going on.
Yeah. I didn't like me.
Okay. So, well, let's get back to it. So, before we get too far, I'm just going to let you know, well, before we talk about the genetics, I got a little disclaimer for you. I am not a geneticist. And to tell you the truth, I don't even really play one on TV. But I do know a little something about spawning child processes. These are all my children. Yes. I take sympathy and donations. So these are the 7 kids that I take care of. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them are mine that I produced. Now that'll tell you it's a yours, mine, and ours situation, but it kind of makes you think a lot about genetics and a lot about like why things happen. If you notice, they all kind of look the same. Can anybody tell which ones are mine and which ones aren't? No? Hard to tell? Well, I'll point them out. So my stepson, who's over there on the far, I guess for you guys, the far left, that's my stepson, and then 2 over with glasses is my stepdaughter. The rest of them are all mine. Now, they all have blue eyes, which is kind of crazy, but my wife has blue eyes and my ex has blue eyes. And that's kind of an interesting thing, because blue eyes is what we get from single inheritance. Is anybody familiar with single inheritance? Single gene inheritance, it has, especially the eye color, has nothing to do with the X chromosome. It doesn't fall on the X chromosome. So it's a recessive gene that actually is passed on. Well, now, when doing a little research, my wife and I can never have brown-eyed kids. Why is that? Well, because when you look at it, brown is a dominant gene. So if one of us would have to have brown eyes, otherwise we would never have brown kids. We both carry 2 recessive genes for blue eyes. So I'm helping to extend blue eyes. Because as everybody knows, blue eyes is apparently on its way out. It's, you know, brown eyes is the new thing. So apparently in a few years, redheads is another thing that's supposed to be on its way out. Like the number of genes, because it's a recessive gene, it should die out over time. This is kind of curious. So when you start thinking about that, you can also look at, so I'm 5'10" and a half. My wife is 5'4", 5'5", maybe with shoes on. But all our kids range in height. Well, that's kind of an odd thing too. Why is that? Well, you know, Darwin talked about natural selection and things like that. But there's another one, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. I don't know if you've heard about this. He actually talked about like the environment dictating like height and stuff like that. But he also said that like his theory was that species evolved because the parents evolved. So like giraffes, the reason their necks are long is because the parent had to reach up to grab food. So like kids had to reach up to grab food, and over time, everybody had to reach up, their necks got longer. This was back in 1800s, it made total sense. But when you think about it, if I cut my arm off and have a kid, is my kid gonna have 1 arm or 2 arms? 2 arms. If I cut my kid's arm off, his kid, and then his kid, and then his kid, and this kid, 20 generations. Will there ever be a kid with only 1 arm? No. So, that was actually ruled out. Good. Sonny's got it. Sonny understands. I got this. So in any case, so that's, you know, it's really interesting to see how genes progress. So we do have this this case where we have mitosis, which is a copy of a gene. So when we're born, we have our mitosis. Our mitosis actually replicates like skin cells. So your skin cells that you're carrying around today are the same cells that you had at the time of fertilization. It's a genetic copy. It's a one-to-one sort of thing. It takes the entire gene that it has and copies it over and splits into 2 cells, replicating the original cell. Meiosis, on the other hand, is what we get through inheritance, where we actually take one cell, it splits itself and shares half of its genes with another cell. Or we do it through gametes and through fertilization. So then that's where we get this split. Now, that being said, when we do this split, it's not always a one-for-one. Like, you don't always get all your mom's genes or all your dad's genes. You get a mixture of them. So that's where you get this variance. One of the things, I'm going to talk a little bit about inheritance. Don't worry, we're not going all OO. But we're going to talk about blended inheritance real quick, because this is a topic that's going to be covered. If we have blended inheritance, meaning that we have an average of the 2, what would actually happen over time? Well, if I'm 5'10" and my wife is 5'5", and blended inheritance is a thing, eventually all the kids would get to where everybody would be the exact same height. So that can't work. So one of the things when I go into the meiosis, which we're not going to get into tonight, sorry, saving that for Erlang Factory, but when we get into that, we're going to have to actually determine like which genes are shared and split the genes, so that when we replicate these in processes, we only share half the gene pool. So the next generation only has half of the genes, depending on which one the parent gave. Why am I doing this, aside from it being fun? Well, Erlang really, I guess, underneath everything, runs in processes. And so it's really easy to divide things up into processes and have a single organism be a single process that then just sends off its genes to replicate. So in meiosis, mitosis is really easy, because all we have to do is send off the genotype, which genotype is just basically a collection of all your genes, your DNA, and sending over to the next one. It's actually a lot easier to do, because you can just say, I don't care. All I care about is how long the cell lives and what the reproduction rate is of the cell, and I can actually watch that cell multiply over time. So, that being said, we're going to start talking a little bit about like what the code was that actually happened, or that I used. Like I said, this is a meetup. What does everybody want to see at a meetup? They want to hear me stand up here and talk about genetics and then kind of talk about code? No, you want to see code, right? So, let's do this. And you guys can all read that, right? Of course you can. Let me bump this up here, and then of course, now I get to try to control it. Now I am going to switch to American on the screen. So give me just 1 second. There it is. My mouse. Of course, that's not the screen that I wanted to mirror. Now, where did it go? Of course, now, we got a lot of technical difficulties. This is actually happening live right now.
We're all friends here.
But you are on TV.
I was about to say, me and the millions of viewers at home, right? Oh, and of course I forgot to plug in my power too, so.
Need power?
Yeah.
Yeah. was like, I'm brass.
Thank you, sir. And to make things even more fun, mine is backwards. So before you get up and give a talk, the first thing that you should do is you should close all the stuff that you're gonna be. So it makes it easier to find things that you're trying to look for. It's still not popping up. Well, of course, it wouldn't be a good talk if there was no technical difficulties, right?
Pizza's here, so.
Oh, that's always a bonus. See, this is what you get for not coming, because now you don't have pizza. Because there's no way to get pizza at home. Right?
This is pretty good pizza.
Huh?
This is pretty good pizza.
Let's see here. I cannot find this window at all. Didn't really close the whole window. You guys didn't have anywhere to be tonight, right? So definitely hang around. Aha. Look at that. All right, is that a little bit better? Can y'all see that? All right. Okay, it'll just be a little bit more difficult for me, so. All right, so the first thing that we went ahead and did is we needed to actually define what an organism is, right? So the best way to do this is to say we have a process, a gen server. So we're actually going to have the gen server that's just going to start the link. It's going to, on init, it's going to actually take the genotype, which we said the genotype is all we care about for mitosis is the time to live and the reproduction rate. So that is actually our genotype that we're worried about passing on from generation to generation. Now, with this, what we do is we actually call the handle info, which that's just the easiest way to get to it from the init. We're going to actually kick off the life cycle for this. Now, the life cycle is basically going to call, it's going to send a process after a set amount of time. Now, the time that it's waiting for is the time that it has to, before it can reproduce. So it waits until it can reproduce again and then sends a signal to say, okay, I'm ready to reproduce. Go ahead, and we're going to age the organism first. And these numbers we'll get into. This is kind of some of the good bits that it's good to understand what's happening. But we're going to age the organism by 1.2 so that we actually make it take longer to reproduce. At the same time, we're going to reduce the amount of time it has to live because things age. We want to actually, over time, we want the thing to stop reproducing because the age that it has, it doesn't have time to reproduce, and so it just dies off. Once that actually happens, we go up here. Hold on one second. It was actually an alarm to tell me that I was supposed to be here. I told you I thought I was supposed to be here at 7. So in any case, so what we're going to do is we're going to age the organism. The aging of the organism is going to update that genotype, because the genotype is really how we're going to convey, hey, we're going to die at some point in time, and we're going to we're going to increase the time it takes us to reproduce. So, that being said, just having a single organism as a process doesn't really do us much good. So our gene pool, we got a seed genotype. We're going to start the thing. We're going to start a supervisor first. The supervisor is just a simple supervisor, but it has one worker. It's the life processes. So our life process. Now, originally I was thinking about going with gen event to notify a gen event that actually just goes ahead and says, okay, it's time to reproduce, sends off the thing. So it's listening, waiting for an event, and sends that back to the supervisor to say, okay, this cell has just reproduced. But honestly, I found it kind of cumbersome. It was easier just to send something back to say, hey, I'm reproducing. But I still do it through the life events, because this later on when we talk about, when I start getting into the meiosis piece of it, it's going to be more important, because now you have to notify something that, hey, I'm ready to reproduce, and then something else has to say, I'm ready to reproduce, and then you can actually merge the two and start the new process. So we'll kind of use that for fertilization at a later point. But we also have our Petri dish, which is essentially another supervisor. So we're supervising a supervisor. And our Petri dish is going to be something pretty simple. Basically just knows about the worker. Now, the things to note in this worker are that it's a transient worker. So it doesn't start by default. It has to be started dynamically. The other thing is that we do a simple one-for-one on the restart, because we don't want it to just automatically restart these processes. We want it to be a dynamic process that's restarted and added as a child, but at the same time, it does not get restarted when it dies, because, we can go all Lazarus at some point, but I think for the most part, we want them to die and stay dead. So, there we have a simple meiosis process. The supervisor starts up, drops an organism, which is our process in there. Our organism starts a life process that then, over time, iterates over and says, okay, I'm going to reproduce, I'm going to reproduce, I'm going to reproduce, and then eventually dies. So, playing with these numbers. So we're going to do the happy path first, where everything lives and dies, but we're going to also look at kind of some fun things where we play around with these numbers and see what happens. Yeah, that was fun when I was first experimenting. So we'll play with some numbers and let me see what we come up with. So, something simple here. We're just going to start IEX. Let's see how fast. Okay. Now, this is fun to find. Are you guys familiar with UbiGraph? I figured you would be. I figured there's a couple of them. All right, so now I can zoom in on this too. I'm going to try to make this big so we can see it, but I also have to. Where's the edge of this thing? Oh. Okay, let's see if we can find our processes in here. So if you've ever used Observer, right? You can see your process, but it's a very flat 2D. UbiGraph allows you to zoom in and see processes. Okay, there we are. I see them over there. There we go. I know that's probably hard to read, but you're going to be able to tell exactly what it is in just a second. And I'll point them out real quick. So we have, sorry if I'll try to talk loud to make sure the mic still gets it. This is our supervisor, this is our Petri dish, and this is our life event. These are what we're going to be watching here. Now, we've actually set, or I guess I've set, we've defined our organism as, where? We've kind of given a seed to our organism. So we have a default time to live and a default reproduction rate. So we're going to have those numbers adjust over time. Let's go down here and gene pool. Begin life, because that sounds so important, doesn't it? All right. Let's see if we can watch this happen. Now, what we're going to actually watch is it's just going to continue to spawn life over and over again. I'm going to grant these are empty processes, but you could also imagine implications for this, like where you could actually use this in the real world, not just in test. Now, they're all going to start dying off. They all die off at a varying time, but eventually you go back to everything's dead. Now, you see the fluttering one? I'm worried that that's a bug, but at the same time, I'm not sure if it's a bug with my code or if it's a bug with OTP Graph. Because I don't think it was intended to start necessarily to monitor that many processes ballooning up and then going away all at the same time. I'm sure it should be able to handle that, but it also seems weird that like it stops at some point. So,
It's becoming self-aware.
exactly, it's becoming self-aware. Well, that comes up in the meiosis one. So let's look at these numbers. So we can kind of play with some of these. Now, the first one I'll do is, let's comment out this one. So our reproduction rate doesn't change. We always reproduce at the same rate. Actually, you know what? What the hell? We'll let these things live forever. This is actually just a cool test of what Erlang can take. Because, I mean, ultimately, yes, we're using Elixir, but ultimately this falls on the EVM or the Beam virtual machine to handle this. So, we can go back to our OTP graph, which is reset for us. Let's make sure, although this is going to be painfully obvious. There they are down there. Try to get them to a spot where, as you can imagine, this is kind of fun to try to play around with, and you can waste a lot of time doing it. What's funny is there's been a few times where I've gotten it moving, and then I forget, I go back over to the other window, and I'm like, oh man, I lost everything. All right. There we go. Now, let's see. Gpool begin life. Okay. Now, I'm just going to talk for a while, and we're just going to kind of see how long it goes. None of these processes will ever die. They're just going to live on forever. Now, this could never happen in real life, because when you think about it, your skin cells eventually are going to die off. Like, when you die, they don't keep living. They don't keep reproducing. And over time, you don't reproduce cells at the same rate that you do when you get older. Unfortunately, I'm hitting 40 and my cells are starting to reproduce a lot slower than. Now the cool thing about this, from a, hey, I've got to monitor my system, let me go in here and find the process I'm looking for. Yeah, see, that thing's just gonna go forever. Now, I will eventually make this code available after the talks, and so that people can kind of go around and play with it, especially once you start getting into the, it does appear to be slowing down. Now, I don't know if it's slowing down because OTP Graph is slowing down, or if it's slowing down because my laptop can only take so much. But as you'll see, it will continue to fill up processes and just continue. Now, we can also kill this. There we go. All right. But really, the functionality of the mitosis one is all based on what these times are, how long these things are actually going to live, how long they're going to reproduce. Now, this is kind of cool, and the next step to be with this would be to introduce a mutation. When you think about it, especially with mitosis, if you want to watch like cancer cell mutation, just because you get cancer doesn't mean your kids are going to get cancer. It's because it happens through mitosis. You can have some type of environmental effect on your cells that cause the DNA of the cell to actually change. So these are all interesting things that you could use Elixir to actually kind of get into, or Erlang for that matter, anything that you can monitor all these processes. you can actually introduce things. One of the things in the Erlang factory talk that I'm getting into is dealing with something similar to Chaos Monkey. If you're familiar with the Chaos Monkey project, it basically can grab random processes and kill them off, and so that you can kind of test your system on what would happen in a real world scenario where you actually have failing things. Do they restart? Do they recover? I'm actually working on an implementation where it grabs a random processes and updates the genetic makeup of it, so that over time, now that one changes. I think in one of the things that I read, it was a great example, and I'm going to share it with you, is that so with mitosis, that genetic altering, say for some reason you go all Bruce Banner and walk into some gamma ray, and all of a sudden now your cells have changed. All your cells have been altered so that they all reproduce differently than they would, but of course you don't pass that on. So any offspring of Bruce Banner would not have necessarily those genes. So using something like this, something like Elixir, something like Erlang, to be able to replicate these in a relatively easy way, to monitor how genes. Now, genes in general, they're very deep, as far as like there's 23 chromosomes that make up or 23 pairs of chromosomes that make up human genome. So it's like, there's a lot of variations that you could run into, but you could also use that to test like different patterns, what's going to happen. If I introduce this change, if these two characteristics mate, or these two people mate, and they share characteristics, what will the outcome be? There's a lot of experiments with what they call model organisms. The fruit fly is one that they use a lot, not because scientists are particularly interested in what happens with fruit flies, but because they have a nice short lifespan and they mate frequently. And so you can actually watch over time mutations happen and variations in their genome as they kind of progress through. So there's a lot of interesting things that you can do with genetics, and Elixir actually makes it very easy to get into. So that's like a little preview of the Erlang factory talk. I tried to pare it down to where it wasn't like, hey, let me just get up here and give the whole talk, because there is something else that I want to talk to you about. But at the same time, I wanted to give you enough to where you need to kind of see like an idea of what's going to happen. The next steps, like I said, the next step to this, aside from any adjustments, and we can play around with the numbers too if you guys would like to see like what happens like, hey, if we switch this or that. But like I said, the next step for this is a mutation. And then the mitosis one, we're actually going to look at the color of an organism. And we're going to have red, green, and blue organisms. And so the red organisms are going to actually be the dominant organism. So if a red encounters a green, it's going to be the dominant. If a green encounters blue, it's going to be the dominant. And then we're going to actually adjust like the rate of reproduction. So yes, red might be a more dominant gene, but at the same time, it reproduces way slower than, say, the blue, which is less dominant. What happens over time? How do we actually see that? Mitosis, which is here, is great for ubigraph, because you can watch all those. You don't really care about what's happening because you understand that it's the same all the way through. Whereas with the meiosis, it's going to be an interesting example. I'm going to actually write back out so that we have a browser open and using Canvas to actually have these elements show up on the screen. So it should be pretty cool. Does anybody have any questions about this piece? No? Okay, cool. So let's move on to, shoot, it's right closed.
Do you happen to have a diagram of the hierarchy you had there? Of, like you had lifespans and all this. Do you have I guess a slide showing your supervisor tree or how your app is structured?
I didn't actually put a formal one together. That probably would be a good thing to include, so that way you can kind of see the hierarchy of like what's actually happening. Yeah. Well, and that's what I've got, like most of the slides kind of done, and it's like what I'm kind of talking about, but at the same time, yeah, little helpful hints like that, like being able to show the hierarchy. Right now I cover like what mitosis is versus what meiosis is, and then I kind of show through the cell type stuff, but showing the hierarchy of the actual application will probably be handy. So we're going to look at this project that I did recently. So a friend of mine actually had asked me to, he needed an API. He was actually building an Android and iOS client. He had some third party doing it. And he already had an existing system. So that's my disclaimer on this talk. So if you see column names and things like that, don't hit me on it. It's not mine. I was forced to use them. Come on, what developer hasn't been given it? This is the database. This is the way it has to be. You're going to use it the way it is. But the idea was that I was going to throw together something quick. The nice thing about that is it allowed me to actually have a nice small project that I could come to user groups like this and show off and say, look, because a lot of times I talk about how I use Phoenix, but until you actually show somebody the code, like I don't see it. Now, for most of you, Sonny, you might know this. Phoenix sits on top of Plug. I was just teasing it. For those of you not are at home, Sonny's back in the back eating pizza. So it looks like he's enjoying it. He's going to get another slice. Yeah. So.
You want some?
Oh, yeah. That's rude to eat and be on TV, right? So, in any case, so it sits on top of Plug. Well, part of the thing that always kind of got to me was the fact that I had to have these controllers. I got involved with Phoenix back when Chris was first started working on it. I'm going to go all hipster on you. You know, I was using Phoenix before it was cool. But back when it was just a router, and I really liked the router piece of it. This was even pre-Plug. When Plug came around and it started moving to being built on Plug, I was like, this is great. I can use just the router. I don't necessarily have to use all the other things. I don't need controllers, I don't need models, I don't need anything like that. When I was using Ruby, I was a big fan of DCI, data context interaction. So the idea is that you had data that was transforming based on context. So this is kind of the principle that I've kind of carried over into now. A couple of things. So, what looks the same? So we have your typical router, but the difference is my routes don't map to, and some of this naming is just so that it's explicit, you know what it's going to, but it's the context that route is used for. So I actually route these directly to a plug. So like if I need to get, this is for API work, so if I need to get a set of locations, I want to return a list of locations and I want it to be JSON. I'm just going to say locations route maps to this plug knows how to deal with a list of locations in this context. Now one of the pieces, and I've actually been talking to Chris, because I tried to explain this to him and it wasn't until I showed him the code that he actually realized the use case. I don't want to have to put an action at the end. Where you see these have like locations, departments, categories, persons responsible. Like I said, don't beat me up on naming, that's not my fault. But that is superfluous information. I don't need that information there. But because there's no default for an empty action, I don't have that. Now, Chris added an issue so that they're actually looking at taking that out of, setting a default value for that, so you can just map directly to a plug. Now, my plugs, let's see, here. So let's look at that get locations. So this is my, oh wait, yeah, this is my plug. Let me split this real quick. View split. Yay, look at that. Actually, you know what, I'm just going to full screen this. So we don't need the Ubi graph anymore, so. I'm splitting these so that you can see. It still doesn't look good.
HDMI.
Yeah. So just so you know, those top lines say def module. The one on your right is actually just a generic handler that I put together so that way my plugs, I don't need all this extra data. I have my init, my call, my imports. I do a little, which I've gotten in trouble with. You'll hear me get yelled at this week on the Elixir Fountain by Chris, because I just pull in JSON instead of using a view where I'm supposed to use a view. But in any case, I have this controller that basically just says, I just need that one, just that one function from the controller, just import that one function. It's one of the nice things about a compiled language is it just pulls that in. I don't have to pull all of the controller in just for that one thing. And then I pipe the connection to a respond, which the respond, in this case, looks for a very specific param. If that param is there, it knows, hey, I can do my thing, and then it's going to call in to get the list of locations for the query. Then the response is passed on, the header is updated, and it's moved on over. If it doesn't match up, if this request comes in and that param is not there, it knows that it's invalid. It's going to send back a message and halt the request, and so that it doesn't continue through. Now, one thing that you'll notice is the query API. When I do my test, I don't care about what's happening in the database. I assume that if I make a get locations call, I'm going to get specific data back. So what I do is I actually have a config value that says, in this case, in test, use get locations. The get locations query is actually a sandbox. In dev or production, it actually goes to the actual query class, which we'll look at in a second. And then that get locations query is just a call to whatever module is provided, and then it does a run with those params. I can do any type of filtering or anything like that based on the params here. The query is responsible for actually doing any type of validation. This is a pretty simple case where there's not a whole lot of validation. It's either got a division or it doesn't. And then you'll see when we get to the query that it's either going to match up or it's not. Now, one of the other libraries that I use is Mobius. Has anybody heard of Mobius? So Mobius is a functional query tool that we're going to look at here real quick that was written by Rob Connery originally. It's a library that I've been contributing to quite a bit. But it's supposed to be a super simple query tool. If you don't have a repo, there's no mapping back to anything. You set up what the database is, and then you build a query, and all it does is create the SQL for you and then send it off. Currently, it's sending it through Postgres, but we're also looking at doing EPG SQL. The version 2 might be using EPG SQL because we're finding that the performance is notably better between EPG SQL and using I think he's using Poolboy with it, what he's testing around right now. I've been kind of caught up in my talk project, so it's like I haven't been contributing to it as much, but he keeps me in the loop as to what's going on. Queries. So let's look at that get locations queries. That way you can see the whole thing, because we don't need to share screens here. This is all you really need. Once again, do not beat me up over column names. This is not my fault. Basically, you import a Mobius query, and then you run the query. Well, all we're doing is saying the DB you pass it the table name that you're wanting to use, which can be any table. You run a filter on it. In this case, we're just filtering by division. And then we run the select command is used to actually set, hey, these are the columns that we're going to use. And then it executes. It returns the values back. And it comes back basically as maps that can easily be moved over to JSON. That's one of my queries. Now, there is a more complicated one. I like to keep things simple. This one's a little more complicated. So these uses right here are these imports, importing the Mobius query. Now, if you'll notice, I'm doing except with, because with was put into Mobius prior to with being in Elixir. And so that now we have to, for right now, we're just excluding it. But in the next version, we're actually going to take it out and use something different. Chronos is what I'm actually using for date-time formatting. It's my library, so I used it. That's not to say that Timex isn't better or anything like that, but you gotta eat your own dog food sometimes. So, and this is a basic insert. Now the cool thing about the way this comes in is we're either gonna get params or we're not gonna get params. I would be doing more validation and things like that if this was a, hey, this is getting ready to go to production. In fact, the next step for this project is to now take it from, hey, throw together something quick for me that uses the existing data that basically is just going to go out to where we're actually going to do a little bit more validation and things like this. But it's a simple insert. The one thing that we have to do is we have to clean dates. One of the problems with Postgres is the way that it handles dates. EPG SQL does not seem to be having those same problems, which is kind of nice. So this is what I'm doing to handle dates coming in and out. I basically said that I'm sticking to a JSON date format, so all dates coming in have to match up to that date format, but it allows me to do a quick binary match and say, okay, if the date matches up like this, I'm going to build a Postgres timestamp and send it in.
That's probably because Ecto does casting automatically.
Right, Ecto actually has like an Ecto date time, which if you use Ecto date time, cast into Postgres timestamp. So yeah, there's been a lot of discussion between Jose and Rob and I about whether or not dates and how to deal with dates. Because anybody that's done Erlang for any amount of time has encountered dates, and they are kind of a pain. It's on one hand, it's nice.
Are dates ever not a pain?
Yeah, but it's a different kind of pain. I mean, on one hand, when I first saw it, I was like, this is ridiculous. Why would anybody handle it as tuples? But on the other hand, it's kind of nice because I don't care what format it's in. I know if it's in two tuples, it's a date time, and I don't have to worry about it. You know, whether or not somebody wanted to use slashes or, hyphens or whatever they want to dots, I love it when people try to submit a date with dots in it. It's like, really? So in any case, so you don't have to deal with, this is basically how I'm doing a type of validation because I need to convert the dates. It's not really a validation as much as it's converting the dates for it. But it's nice because with Mobius, and I'm pretty sure it's similar, but say I have a case where I'm doing a distance search. And so there's actually some SQL that has to be written because there's not any library. We've talked about moving it into Mobius where we're doing like GIS searching. It's actually kind of a nasty little piece of SQL that you have to write to get it in there. It's not too bad, but it's not something that most people want to write. So the idea is to maybe do the distance query. Well, the first implementation, all I did was write a filter that took the command because it works similar in the idea that you're piping this query command through. And so you just have something that accepts a query command and returns a query command, and you can do whatever you want in there. You can mess with the params, you can, in my case, I was actually adding an additional where predicate to it. So it's nice, it's extendable. Even if Mobius doesn't handle your particular SQL case, you can always just accept a query command, modify it how you need it, and then pass it on, and it works it's going to execute the same way. So, does anybody have any questions on this? No questions at all? Huh?
One thing that's surprising to me thus far is you seem to have, I'm just curious why there seem to be a lot of non-interface functions that aren't private. Like it seems like the timestamp and the date string would be something that you wouldn't want to be as part of the interface in this query module.
Yeah, I mean, you could make them private. I mean, this is I threw it together really quick type
Okay,
app.
and I mean, I'm not trying to say like, I'm just curious if there was a reason for that.
Not really, because the other thing is, I mean, I don't know that I necessarily want to keep them there either.
Yeah.
And so there's another one that actually has a need for doing another query that actually has a need for these. And so the idea, this particular project, like my intent is to move these out, but really this was something that needed to happen to deal with this particular scenario that I know has to really be addressed in Mobius. This isn't something that I should have to do daytime in my application to deal with the way my query tool wants to deal with dates. To me, that's something that the query tool should handle.
Have you seen anyone else using this approach of routing straight to plugs?
I don't know that I haven't. Most people that I've seen using Phoenix use it in the typical, I create a controller, I have actions that I'm using, and to me, there's nothing inherently wrong about that. If that fits like the way that you like to code and the way that your application works, then that's fine. This is more of a case of, I don't necessarily need that. Like I don't, like even for location, a lot of things are based on context. Like I don't need a controller to deal with, set up a resources for locations where I'm just doing the one thing.
But a Phoenix controller is just a plug.
It is. Actually, one of the things when I was talking to Jose about this last week, and I'm actually going to do a longer, more like a video where like we build an API like this, and I kind of go through like the approach that I'm taking. I'll cover more like the testing side of it as well. But one of the things that Jose said was, and I have the code here on my laptop somewhere where he's like, what you should do is you should say, yeah, this is how I do it. But really, if you wanted to implement your own controller, here's the 3 functions that you need to do to turn this into a controller. And so I think it's more so to challenge the way that you think about using Phoenix, and to really show that Phoenix underneath is just plugged, so there's no reason to, a lot of people come into it. It's bothersome to me that people keep making the Rails comparison, and I'm really getting tired of it. It's not Rails. It's nothing like Rails. It's like Rails in the same way that Rails is like .NET MVC. Yes, they're both using the MVC pattern, but that's about it. And really, in Phoenix, MVC pattern is one of the ways that you can use it, obviously. And this is one of the reasons why I want to go around this route, is to show that it's not necessarily that way. You kind of can mold Phoenix to do what you want. And really, there's the talk that I had with Chris. He's going to go over some of the new things that are this week on the Elixir Fountain that's in store. I won't, burst his, but I'll let him say it. But there's a lot of things in store, and he kind of feels the same way. It's like having this modular. It's moving now from what it originally started as like a router that became a web framework to really now it's more of an application framework. Because you can do many things that don't necessarily have anything to do with the web, including the separation now that they're working on with the PubSub piece, where you could use it in any application that requires PubSub. So I think it's really more about challenging people to stop thinking in, hey, I'm moving to language X, where's framework Y? Oh, this looks just like it, oh, this is my thing. I mean, when you look at projects, especially a lot of the embedded stuff, where they're dealing with like the NERDS project, the things that you're doing, I mean, even the talk that I'm giving, as far as like the genetics talk that I'm giving, it's really to kind of challenge people to think about different ways of working with this language, and the power that you have and the capabilities that you have to really kind of think. I don't want to say think outside the box, because that's like so cliche, but it's cliche to say it's so cliche. But
think outside the bun, perhaps. Think outside the bun, perhaps.
Exactly. Yeah. Not just, hey, I need to build X. What's the framework like I'm used to using? Let's look at problems a little differently, because the way you solve problems is different. I think if any of you guys listened to the Joe Armstrong talk that when I had him on, at least 2 weeks ago now, he was like, developers overcomplicate things. We're always looking to build this whole like, oh, we need to do this library and this library and this. It's like, those things are pretty simple. And if you change the way you think about stuff, you start seeing things in a very simple way. And you don't need all this stuff built up around everything. So, anything else? Any other questions?
Could you go back to the router?
Mm-hmm.
I'm still trying to hold that in my mind. Like,
yeah. So, you're talking about like the way this is?
yeah, I'm just saying, sort of in that's the API scope there.
Yeah. So, and really, hopefully, this is what I would like. It's something like that. It just says, go do this thing. But for right now, I have to do this. Now, I've done everything from doing this. To me, I was like, well, none seems weird to have, because then it's like, I mean, you're talking about the context. Say this is 4 locations, and just be fine with it. But I think teaching people to leverage the whole plug piece of it is another important thing, where there's a lot you can do with plugs. And yes, controllers are basically plugs extended. But there's also code that is kind of, it's not necessarily required, but I mean, there's a certain amount of setup that's involved with, like, if you're going to use controllers, you need to set up actions. Actions have to act a certain way, you know. And I mean, they're essentially plugs, but I mean, to me, it's like, well, why not just call them to the plug? I mean, why have that extra step? Because the other thing is, when you do it like this, is if you have that functionality set up, now you can chain plugs. I would assume maybe there's some like weird way you can chain controllers because there are plugs, but I don't know why. But like in this case, so say I have.
Yeah, as long as the action doesn't try to render first.
Exactly. See, in this case, if I say I want to call these 3 plugs, even though they're different routes, they're still just plugs. So I might have, you know, a plug that I route to that collects 3 plugs that need to happen because it's just chaining the connection and it just goes and does the thing that it needs to do and adds on to the response. Now, I would have to change the way that I'm doing it a little bit here because I would probably have to have my generic handler deal with, like, in the end, like the way that it deals with sending the response back might have to be a little bit different. But the possibility is there to where if you needed to chain things along, to say I need to have these 3 things come in. Now in that case, it might be a good idea to set up actions because you can get the action in the plug, as you call it. So you could say, in this case, I'm not gonna return a result. I'm just gonna update, you know, something that's going back.
Well, then you've got the option of using pipelines, which are basically plugs that chain together other plugs. And then you've got each controller, and a Phoenix controller has plugs, its own plug pipeline that you can have, you know, use the guards as well to, you know, make sure that it only happens on certain actions.
Exactly.
So there's lots of flexibility, but yeah, it would definitely be better, or it would be very nice to be able to leave off the action parameter on the back of the router macros. Because I had a similar conversation with Chris when I was building, helping to build the Omnion or the Uber auth stuff. And so we had a plug that we were trying to do a very similar thing, but we always had to add this extra parameter. So I think what we ended up doing was just like doing a get to a controller, but then just plugging the Uber auth plug in the controller itself.
Yeah.
Instead. So.
Yeah, I think that one piece, and it's really, I think it's just is it plug options? I think is what it is.
Yeah.
There's a feature request in there. Chris put it in there the other day when we were talking. I was thinking about going back in and updating the feature because he just put in the issue as a new feature, but didn't put any explanation. And so I was like, I should probably go in there and update that. And I said I would do it, and then he said that, he would take care of it because he was going to be working on stuff anyway. But I think it's been a couple of days. I mean, I don't know why he's not just sitting around waiting to fix features that I asked for. So. It's like he's got stuff to do or something. I don't know. Cool. So any other questions? Awesome. Well, you know, you can check out the Elixir Fountain. I know that you know, we got this week coming on. We have Chris is going to be on there. Next week is Paul Lamb, and then we have, I think, Jose is going to be on the following week. The other thing is I'm actually organizing a conference called Elixir Days. If you haven't heard about it, if you haven't been following Elixir Fountain or Elixir Days or me, because I've been tweeting about it constantly. We actually have Chris McCord keynoting. We also have Rob Connery keynoting. We've got several talks that I'm supposed to be picking through right now. We'll be announcing this week. I will send out a coupon code because the early bird is already passed, but I know a lot of people have waited to figure out who the speakers were. It's actually not that bad of a drive from here to Jacksonville if you want to come on down. And it's actually in St. Augustine, but it's 45 minutes difference if you drive that far, something like that. But I'll give you guys a discount code so that if you guys want to come down, you can still get a discount rate. It'll probably be Nash EX maybe. So something along those lines just so I can track who's coming down and who's using the code. And so if anybody wants to come on down, you're more than welcome to come down and check out the day. One unique thing about this conference is we have 8 talks that we're going to have, but at the end of the day, we're actually doing a 2.5 hour, what we're calling helping hack. So the idea is that, you know, when I go to a conference, a lot of times I get so excited. I hear great talks, and I'm so super excited to get home and work on this stuff, and then I get in, and hold on, let me show you something real quick. Where's it at? I get so excited to be home, and then, you know, I'm going to work on all this stuff, and then this happens. We had 7 people, plus my wife, all want to hang out and talk. I'm like, okay, I'll get through the weekend. I'll get back to work on Monday. I'll get my work done, and then I can, you know, have a little time after work. I'll just set aside to work on it. It doesn't happen. And so then a week goes by, and I'm like, I never got to that stuff. I can't even really remember which pieces I was going to look at. So our idea is that you come, you listen to the 8 talks. We're going to have projects set up. One of them is actually going to be a nerves project, to where you'll be able to actually work with that. You come in, we're going to break everybody into groups of like 10. They're going to be able to work on the project. They're going to have something they can take home and play with, that they've actually worked with the people like speaking on it, or other people from the community. So the idea is to like help everybody, so that you really walk away from the conference feeling like you know, you kind of cemented in what you were talking about, or what you heard talked about. So, and I'll get that code out to you probably maybe this evening when I get back to that hotel or so. Cool. Anything else? Sounds good. Thanks for having me.